Hola,
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
bien, ¿no?
Bien.
Bueno, hoy tenemos la sexta edición de Archivo Redux, la sexta. Sí.
Sí, gracias.
Vamos a ver la conferencia de Jesse Reiser del 2 de agosto de 2018, que se llama Projects Under Consequences.
Sí, que en realidad esa semana sí estuvo en Ditela una semana larga, casi 10 días, y la conferencia era un jueves, pero ya llevábamos con él desde el lunes haciendo un lab, y bueno, el contexto, digamos, de la conferencia fue para empezar ese, y, y creo que en este caso hay como mucho para hablar en ese sentido, ¿no? O sea, creo que la visita de Jesse fue claramente muy vinculada a la relación que tiene con Ciro y nos reveló muchas cosas que estaban como en segundos niveles de funcionamiento de ideas y de metodologías de la escuela. Pero bueno, lo vivimos de una manera como muy visceral, ¿no? Muy vital, me parece.
Y claro, Jesse habrá llegado, no sé, en algún momento del fin de semana
Sí.
y lo vimos el lunes, los profesores que participábamos del lab, de los que nosotros estábamos, y los profesores del proyecto. Y esto fue un jueves, o sea que había habido lunes, martes, miércoles y todo el día de jueves de revisiones del trabajo que él había propuesto.
Ujú.
Y esto iba a culminar al día siguiente, no, al otro, con un review que fue un review de unas buenas 12 horas, quizás
Sí, fácil.
11 seguro.
Sí.
eh, al día siguiente de esta conferencia hubo una conversación de Jesse con alumnos. De pronto,
Fue el sábado la conversación con los alumnos, a la mañana. Solo que después de esa conferencia organizamos, de hecho tú y yo, esa primera conversación con alumnos que después se ha vuelto una serie con otros visitantes a la escuela, como Bob Sommer la semana pasada. Pero esa fue, ¿te acuerdas? Que armamos un grupito de alumnos en tesis y prepararon unas preguntas, hicimos un back and forth y el sábado a la mañana mismo fue que hicimos esa entrevista, o sea que fue bastante intenso ese sábado, por eso te acuerdas de las 11 horas, creo que estás contando tus
claro,
11 horas de ese día. Sí, sí.
sí, lo que creo que también hubo muchas interacciones con Jesse de muchos tipos diferentes, ¿no?
Sí.
A ver en la sala, es una sala que está llena y tiene como una actividad, si los que vienen viendo o van a ver luego esta serie prestan atención a las audiencias, van a ver que esta está un poco más movediza e inquieta y hay como una cierta excitación en el aire.
Claro, porque estábamos ya como en confianza, me parece, con Jesse, y creo que él lo comenta al principio. Para el momento donde estamos en la conferencia, hemos pasado por, o sea, o sea, yo recuerdo, Jesse, de entrar en el taller, primero que estuvimos fue especialmente estar en el taller, ese lab. Estamos todos haciendo algo que no habíamos hecho nunca antes. El ejercicio era hacer una intervención o un proyecto en el Teatro Mannheim de Mies y se llamaba Opaque Architecture, solamente para también como que el lab funcionaba en esos términos, pero no sé, yo recuerdo que tú estabas trabajando con globos que hinchabas de estas maneras. Mi grupo estábamos tejiendo con un ¿cómo se dice? Como con un thread bastante grueso, de algodón muy grueso, varias capas que después se vinculaban entre sí como sistemas transversales a eso, ¿no? Y así digo, para decir solamente en lo que estábamos nosotros, pero Jesse entraba con mucha calma y caminaba, ¿te acuerdas? Caminaba como al mismo ritmo, atravesaba el taller siempre con la camisa blanca y los pantalones azules, y se sentaba y hablaba con cada uno y decía cosas increíbles, ¿no? Eh,
Sí, sí, no, me estaba acordando de otras experimentaciones materiales, como que había algunos que trabajaban con algunas gelatinas que se hinchaban con agua, creo que era Josep Ferrando, o Santiago Bósola que trabajaba con espuma de polietileno inyectada y
ujú,
desbordada, todo en el contexto del teatro de Mies, o había algo con bolsas, algo con acrílicos y resina. Digo, había como muchos materiales diferentes, y me parece que, digo, eso es un buen contexto para pensar la conferencia. Y esto que vos decís, los comentarios, y como el caminar entre, como pez en el agua, de muchos materiales diferentes, y muchos profesores diferentes. Sí,
Sí,
comentarios muy diferentes entre sí, pero todos tendiendo a que, no sé, a algo en particular, ¿no? Como de...
sí, yo no sé, yo recuerdo que era como, tendían a una libertad de pensamiento muy fuerte, pero no estrafalaria, sino como muy concreta, ¿no? Como no había una exterioridad respecto de lo que se hablaba, sino que se sentaba y asumía lo que estaba sucediendo como un proyecto que está sucediendo, o sea, no había ninguna duda de que eso estaba pasando y de que estaba delante de él. Y entonces, no sé, en nuestro caso, por ejemplo, estábamos como generando un objeto que tenía como generaba mucho cariño, era como casi como un peluche, y nos empezó a recomendar unas colas que son de maquetación específicas, y llegamos al punto en el cual nos recomendó quemarlo, ¿no? Y para mí ese uncanny, ¿no? De que hicimos un proyecto que daba ganas de abrazarlo y que nos llevara a volverlo casi como fósil de sí mismo, como que quemar ese material para que tomara otra forma y se transformara de vuelta, pero no como negación de lo anterior, sino como evolución de ese proceso que estaba sucediendo. Creo que no nos atrevimos a quemarlo y me arrepiento de eso. O sea, creo que fue como él estaba viéndolo, y creo que varios nos pasó que a lo mejor al final no hicimos el último clic, ¿no? De eso que para él estaba haciendo tan claramente un proceso arquitectónico
Claro.
prolífico.
Sí, ya se revive los comentarios de Jesse, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo sería? Pareciera que te lleva ya a ese lugar como de... que tiene algo como de carnalidad, ¿no? O sea, como de visceralidad, diría. Y los comentarios eran muy viscerales en el sentido de... eh, no sé, me parece que había como una... Y de vuelta, me resuena con cosas que van a aparecer en la conferencia, como una cosa como que los comentarios eran sumamente irresponsables, pero a la vez muy concretos, y uno podría decir abriendo un espacio de experimentación, no en el que de la palabra experimentar, sino en el sentido de que realmente se abrían como abismos casi, abismos por delante, que uno podía darse cuenta que no estaba claro en el comentario, no estaba claro que Jesse lo tuviese exactamente en claro lo que te estaba proponiendo. Había como una zona intermedia, ¿no?
Claro, sí. Creo que la irresponsabilidad como consciente y del disfrute como más infantil, como, no sé, yo me acuerdo de pensar, este señor es como claramente de otra generación y tiene mucha más conexión, digamos, vital que muchos jóvenes, ¿no? O sea, es una persona mucho más joven mentalmente que mucha gente joven. Eso me parece que era muy increíble verlo, pensar y disfrutar de lo que estaba haciendo. Y a lo mejor también es el momento en el que estaba, y creo que ahora debe estar en otro porque ya han pasado un par de años, pero presentó al fin y al cabo el libro que se llama Project Under Consequences, y la idea me parece un poco, al principio de la charla lo va a comentar, y a mí me parece muy interesante como manera de pensarla y de ver la arquitectura y de vivir la arquitectura. Él comenta como cuando empiezas una práctica te insertas en un momento que no conoces, ¿no? En el cual hay ciertos proyectos funcionando, están en marcha ciertos proyectos, y el tiempo en el que te insertas como profesional, digamos, en ese flow de proyectos es un accidente, es casual. Pero esa visión de que no hay un punto de partida, creo que es la que nos inculcó en tan poco tiempo como en una semana, como no había un punto de partida y una consecuencia y una causa respecto de la cual hacer algo, sino que los proyectos empezaban a generar sus propias consecuencias. Y creo que eso es una visión muy, muy reveladora, que después, de algún modo, creo que en la conferencia lo que va a hacer es atravesar 6 proyectos de su producción en términos de qué consecuencias producen, y no tanto de por qué razones fueron producidos, ¿no?
Decías
Sí.
me acordé de una cosa, vuelvo a lo del lab, que con el grupo con el que estábamos trabajando terminamos izando un racimo de globos que sostenía otros globos de la terraza.
Uh-huh.
Un momento...
Un momento legendario.
Sí, sí, fue un momento interesante. Pero digo, porque me parece que en esto que decías hay como una cosa como de seriedad lúdica, o como de responsabilidad y responsabilidad. Y lo de que decías de insertarse en el medio, realmente uno puede ver en la conferencia como toda esa sensibilidad material, porque realmente los comentarios en el lab me parece que eran muy materialmente sensibles, están en algún modo mediados por el medio, o algo así como tratar de entender que empieza en el medio de algo, ¿no?
Uh-huh. Sí.
Empieza en el medio de algo que está empezado,
Uh-huh.
y así, y así, ¿no? O sea, no es que no trata de rastrear un origen, por ejemplo, o trata de pensar en un más allá, hacia dónde va a ir. De hecho, ya la idea de consecuencias está buena, que es, está pensando en lo próximo que sigue, ¿no? O sea, como de...
Uh-huh. Sí. Sí, sí, sí. Bueno, creo que nada, como que hay que verla, la charla. Yo quería, antes de que me olvide, porque le quería comentar una particularidad un poco más operativa que antes te decía, que es que en esta conferencia, la primera parte, que es la presentación que hace Ciro de Jesse, y que Jesse está, lo dijo en ese momento y lo ha dicho varias veces posteriormente, como es muy buen piece of lecture on itself, ¿no? La parte en la que Ciro lo presenta. Lamentablemente no se grabó en vídeo, pero sí se grabó en audio. Entonces, ahora cuando empiece la grabación, va a empezar con un fondo negro, donde se va a escuchar a Ciro presentar, pero no va a haber imagen, digo, para que no digáis, uy, esto no funciona. Entonces, funciona y va a pasar eso.
La intensidad que la cámara no le da la capacidad de...
No podía captar. Entonces, eso es una primera, digamos, un aviso para no perder la paciencia en ese lugar, y en realidad después, yo te comentaba, Manuel, que es una charla que es para escuchar. La imagen de la sala es interesante, y me parece que Manuel lo comentaba recién, de cómo hay un movimiento y una especie de inquietud interesante, como en la sala, pero la pantalla no se va a ver tan bien porque las imágenes son muy blancas y están muy contrastadas. Lo digo también por una cosa de, a lo mejor está bueno como ponérsela y escucharla y ver, pero prestarle como una atención auditiva, porque la manera de hablar que tiene Jessie también tiene mucha concreticidad y las palabras están muy bien elegidas. Y bueno, compensemos un poco la cuestión técnica a lo mejor con esa voluntad de escuchar lo que está comentando.
Buenísimo. La vemos entonces.
Dale, gracias, Manuel.
Nos vemos en la próxima.
Chao.
Hola, buenas noches. Es un gran placer para mí introducir esta charla de Jesse Reiser esta noche con nosotros. Es un placer personal y intelectual, profesional, académico, y incluso a nivel colectivo la siento como una charla muy importante para nosotros como escuela. Así que sin más, solamente decirles que voy a empezar ya presentándolo en inglés, y que la charla va a ser en inglés, y que se animen, que no tengan problemas. Ya verán en mi propio inglés, que no hay razones para quedarse callado. y hagan preguntas sin escrúpulos ni vergüenza. So switch to English now. Jesse Reiser here, who is with us, was this afternoon, just before this lecture, sitting in front of me, reading and looking at the images of his conference this evening, and he would say, "This can get me in trouble," in a very low volume. He kept wondering, not with uncertainty, but rather with, I would say, a certain humor while he would flip through the pages. He was definitely thinking of what to say, when and how exactly, but not worryingly. He had told me many times this week I would not want it to get too convoluted. And yet, I would know that he was not just evaluating the economy of words, nor just measuring the effect of his sayings in the way a politically correct, self-important, solemn architect would do. One knows that he seldom calibrates the efficiency and appropriateness of words, images, and concepts, but rather balances their power, seeing how to manage the depth of meaning and the curiosity of anecdotes with the argument at place. This might be too long, he would add, and he would breathe heavily, and yet his breath was not burdened, but rather strong. He would look at other pages, swiftly gaining progressively in wit and indulgence. He would also assent frequently while looking at certain images, and all of a sudden he would say, "I have to move through this quickly," talking to himself. Jesse was a little nervous maybe, as he was all day, probably even sweating. And yet, more than anxious, he was just eagerly looking forward, like a child. He was not really nervous as such, but excited, passionate, fervent. For the whole day, he had been saying to himself, and sometimes to me, that at 5 p.m. he had to sit down and prepare to get ready. I found pictures of the Kaohsiung port terminal from before and after the war, he suddenly said. Kaohsiung is the 3 million city in Taiwan, which he will show today, where the latest project of Reiser Uemoto is located. And then he laughed strongly and openly, leaving the air full of resonances before they even appeared. Nanako was very enthusiastic about this. It was actually a major target for the Japanese in the war. And then, after the war, it became a tank farm for National Chinese Petroleum. The construction process had to go through 3 years of delay because of this, he said. You will see now today that he will call all these kinds of things a material history of architecture. We had the port have post-industrial uses imposed with a new layer, not to be completely post-industrial. I wanted it more romantic first, but the Chinese said that this was out of date, and that no cruise line would want that, he said, with a mix of straightforward earnestness, material-based poetry, a certain dimension of meanness and delight, and perhaps some residues of melancholy in his voice. In the meantime, he would wave his hands, imitating how the locals would relate to the departures. And he would laugh again. I have to go through this stuff fast, too much material. Jesse Reiser is an unaffected, genuine, cold-bloodedly artful, materially clever, and organizationally ingenious thinker and doer of architecture. His architecture not only far bypasses and actually renders hilarious the division between theory and practice, but also dissolves the gravity with which any project of integration between thinking and doing may be pronounced. To this, he offers an approach to architecture so unusually prolific in ideas, so wealthy in resources, so rich in thoughts, and with a spectrum so free and widely open, and yet so mundane, unpretentious, and robust, that, and you will see and hear today, both thought and imagination get lost. You may encounter some ground by inhabiting this space along the same plane in which it is conceived and nurtured. And this would be today my hope, because you will see that his architecture far from idiosyncratic and far from eccentric, ranges from a sort of, how to call it, alchemic approach, merges the most advanced and forward-thinking scientific models with the most ancient artifacts, sayings, images, and materials in a progressive, ruthless, inventive, and highly conservative, sometimes consciously antiquated form of architecture. One would refer to this as a form of architectural timefulness, as opposed to timelessness. And when I tell him this, he says, actually, I say something like this in my book, his next book, Projects and Their Consequences, which he is anticipating and partially presenting today. A physicist made me realize something like that actually all times or many times coexist right now in the world. Some of my best friends are Stone Age people, he adds. To the most realistic components, to which he often refers as plain facts, he often reacts with a laugh, a joyful laugh, escalating them into a jubilant, ecstatic condition, where he makes clear that doing architecture is an act of thought, a material and creative act of thought. An act that looks for what comes after what is there, ruthlessly, mercilessly, and unscrupulously. To Jesse Reiser, doing an architecture is an act of bending, not just ideologically bending, and then laughing loudly, or laughing ugly. Jesse Reiser, to present him more formally, is an architect and full professor at Princeton University since 2006, after having taught before as a guest professor since 2001, and before that at Columbia from 1992 to 2001, under Bernard Schumi's deanship in the 90s, where he coincided with people like Stan Allen, Greg Lynn, Manuel de Landa, Sanford Quinter, or Jeff Kipnis. Before that, he taught briefly at Yale in 1990 to 92, where he was put, as he said, as a whacked-out Cooper Union and Cranbrook person, as part of a team teaching with new urbanist designers. All of a sudden, very soon after graduating. Together with Nana Komemoto, he founded Reiser Komemoto in 1996, 1997, after coming back from Italy. His multidisciplinary, his multidisciplinary design firm turned into RUR Architecture, DPC, in 1996, and became what nowadays we know as an internationally recognized and admired office that has developed projects at a wide range of scales. From furniture design to residential and commercial projects, up to landscape design, urbanism, and infrastructure, all of which they engage with equivalent devotion, talent, and joviality. Among his most notable projects, we can find his Taipei Pop Music Center and the Kaohsiung Port Terminal in Taiwan, now under construction, which he will show today. But actually, this list extends to a number of influential projects since the 90s, from the Water Garden that he did with and for Jeff Kipnis, or for Jeff Kipnis. He was actually the client. The not winning proposal for the Yokohama Port Authority terminal, which actually disputed during and after the claims of the winning entry as a sort of counter model. The Kansai Library project, reacting to the surface project of the previous, and which I heard from him that he will be somehow presenting as ubiquitously present since then in his work. The Sagaponack House, the Alishan Mountain Railroad project, their first one competition in Taiwan that precedes his current projects in construction, and then their well-known tower in Dubai, O14. Of this, the port terminal has been awarded with the Progressive Architecture Award, and the O14 tower has received numerous international honors, including the AIA Design Award, the Concrete Industry Board's Award of Merit, and the American Council of Engineering Companies Diamond Award. The professional work of Reiser Komemoto has been published extensively and has been awarded with the Chrysler Award for Excellence in Design and the Academy Award in Architecture of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Their theoretical and speculative work has also been profusely published, and in this context, one cannot omit to mention the Atlas of Novel Tectonics, published in 2006, the Reiser monograph published in 1998, and his essays and projects published in several assemblage, AD, and AI file issues, or books like Sites and Stations and Landscape Organism, together with their upcoming book, Projects and Their Consequences, to be published by Princeton Architectural Press this year. We have had, all together, for a few days now, Jesse in the school, and his traces are, I'm sure, not superficial, and not only a few. You can see that this at the studio space downstairs, where people, students and professors are gluing, diluting, melting down, dropping, bending, curling, contorting, accumulating, nailing, and I'm not making up words, inflating, knotting, braiding, knitting, and even burning their materials to render them architectural in an immanent and in an imminent mode. His traces will probably deepen and intensify today with his talk, and I'm sure will blow many people's mind until Saturday. So for now, please join me in giving him a loud and warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't think I can top Ciro's introduction. It's like the best one I've ever received, I think. I'm really, really happy to be here. I think I may have mentioned when I introduced the workshop, but I was at the Ditella 20 years ago when it was in another building and at a much smaller scale. So it's really fantastic, to be back and to be also not just a visitor, but in some sense, I feel like because of the workshop, I can really get to know each one of the professors at some level, and of course all of the students. So the lecture I prepared today, in a sense, is something that I would give more or less en famille. You're kind of part of an extended family as a Ciro. And so I hope you take what I say in the spirit of something that would be said, within your own family. It's, recognizing, I hope, that these projects that I'm going to present today are not only our work, and what I'm going to try to describe really is the intersection between the particular work of RUR, our studio, but that we really rely on the work of our contemporaries. And as young architects, I think it's really important to emphasize that you're entering, I hope, into a culture that has a legacy and one that should be extended, and that there is no ideal starting point. You happen to kind of arrive in terms of the accidents of time and place at a certain moment where probably a number of overall projects in the discipline are being carried out. And so what I'm going to describe as part of this lecture is our reaction to a contemporary's work, and how that reaction to a contemporary's work actually initiated an internal project in the office that went on for something like 16 years. So it's one way of, I guess it's not the way all architects may practice, but because Nanako and I have also been associated with teaching, and through teaching, the students and also colleagues who engaged in a particular direction of work, that has conditioned the type of practice and the kind of work that we do. So I'm going to be talking about generally 6 projects that have been in the office. four of which actually were constructed or are, and to try to make a series of arguments. And it'll be a pretty normal lecture in the sense that I'll just be describing the projects, but embedded in the projects at certain moments I have some digressions which relate more to the logic of those projects and how they fit into a wider context of an overall project in the discipline, let's say, one of the overall projects in the discipline. So I'll start with our proposal for the Angewandte Kunst in Vienna, which was a competition project that we were finalists in. We didn't win it, actually, but it was, and I'll just go into it, and then I'll start developing some of my ideas past that. One of the things about this project, I think, which was important to us, maybe in contrast to some of the earlier work, is that we were particularly interested in trying to develop a particular reaction to the historical and kind of local cultural context of Vienna, to actually tap into probably 19th century models of being in a city and being in the organization of the city, and to somehow turn those in such a way that they would be relevant to this very unique complex of buildings, which was both a school but also connected to a museum. There were figures, especially at the turn of the century, the last century, like Gustav Klimt and Josef Hoffmann, who were really, luminaries and avant-garde artists and architects associated, with the Angewandte, which was kind of a practical school of architecture and crafts and so forth. And then, and presently, or at least during the time the competition was held, an equally well-known faculty, Zaha Hadid, Wolf Prix, Greg Lynn, Hani Rashid, define the roster, at least within the architecture program, of architects. But it's really a complex, of buildings on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. There's an existing there's an existing 19th century building, which is the original building, a kind of honorific triumphal arch entry off the ring, a building built in the early 60s, actually by one of Wolf Prix's professors, which is more of a kind of loft building. And then part of that complex is also the Mack, museum. So everything really is more or less inward looking. And so our proposal was about operating in this very peculiar space, not on the ring itself, but on this courtyard and on the kind of peculiar universe of the courtyard. It was to be an addition mainly to the School of Architecture, but it also involved other elements of the school. So literally extensions of the spaces of the architecture school. So our proposal was actually an inclined bar that connected directly into each of the studio master's spaces and then crossed the courtyard in a kind of very tense way, so that one would be put into a very peculiar relationship both to the kind of courtyard and the fabric, and also, to create a new space. So there's there's the incline bar. It sits on a library. The library forms its own, in a way, entryway for students and faculty. So there's a kind of honorific entry off the ring through a literal triumphal arch, mini triumphal arch, and then there's the universe of professors and students. And we deliberately wanted to kind of formalize that relationship in the project it was really a kind of critique of projects that attempt to be, in a sense, overly democratic in terms of mixing students, the general public, and faculty. We thought it was really important to maintain almost the theatricality of research, production, keeping that behind the scenes part of the life of the school, and that there would be a very particular social interface between the general public and then the work that's produced by the students and faculty. So we didn't want to overly mix those groups, only at specific places when, say, the work was ready. So we took a very different approach than, say, a modernist one, where there would be an assumption about equal mixing of all spaces at all times, or an ambition like that. We really wanted to, in a way, go back to a 19th century model of, how you produce the art should be under wraps and the process, and then there's a particular time and place when the ritual of showing the work, happens. So, yeah, it's an inclined bar, and you can see the library, and then there's a sunken lecture hall. So the general public could have connections, say, to the lecture hall at all times, when there is a lecture, or by extension to an evacuated area of now galleries in the lower portion of the space. But they would maybe be able to see the process of work in a lower courtyard that we created, but they couldn't go into that courtyard normally. It would be kept distinct. So that's a view from Oskar Kokoschka Platz for the entry of professors and students. A view towards the main building. So the exhibition galleries are in this lower grade floor. There's another set of workshops lining the lower courtyard, and then this egg-like lecture hall that sits in this sunken courtyard. Library, again, which this bar appears to rest on, is to the left. And so it also became a very challenging structural problem, because we had to do a building essentially that looked like it was emerging out of the loft building, the 1960s loft building, but the loft building didn't actually have the capacity to carry that bar. So another independent structure had to puncture through the loft building, and so there was columns extend down through those spaces. The structure was a kind of X-shaped structure where the density was mainly on the inside, and you could have greater transparency on the outside of the bar. And then there was another kind of structural prop connected to vertical circulation to basically brace the angled bar of the building. So it was challenging in that way. And then the kind of intersection between that inclined bar and the spaces, produced some very interesting intermediate kinds of space. So I'm gonna, this project, kind of pulling back a little, is actually part of a lineage of projects that started with our Kansai Library project back in the 90s. And so, in a sense, it became even though we were engaging a whole, I have to go back. Even though we were engaging completely different sites and programs, there was a fascination with using a set of spatial and structural principles that we would invert and vary according to the site and the program, but that was the kind of material, the kind of constant material that we were working through. Very much like the Mies problem that I assigned, this week, that Mies didn't, work with a fairly limited set of relations like his ClearSpan projects. There are only 2, and then a limited set of elements that he would specify to particular projects, but it wasn't about starting from zero with each new site or each new program. So I won't go into all the projects, but it deals with the kind of relationship between a structure that would, like in the Kansai library, that was superstructured, and then the slabs hang from that superstructure. In other projects, we inverted that logic, and the project was supported from below. What were tensile members in this case became compressive members in this. But through all those projects, there were various transformation. The Angewandte project took the structure and brought it inside into a kind of crisscross design. Each one, deals with a certain set of transformable logics, but a limited number of them. And so, to pull out a little more, there was an exhibition done at the Museum of Modern Art called the Japanese Constellation. That was about 2 years ago. And so Nanako and I were invited to a panel discussion about the work that was shown at MoMA. It more or less talked about the lineage of work from Toyo Ito to Sejima and then to younger architects. And it sort of posed it as a kind of, very traditional master-disciple relationship. I looked at the projects and I realized that what even Toyo Ito was doing was indeed part of a much longer project that and this is probably somewhat artificial in the sense, but which starts with the OMA, where maybe the first kind of development of the so-called surface project in architecture happened 15 years before. And it slowly develops, even kind of moves from Europe to America, and even literally goes from, in the case of Foreign Office architects, from London to Japan. And that's a crucial moment. So, yeah, this is, we'll move to the Yokohama Port Terminal proposal of FOA. There was an initial proposal done with Cecil Balmond of Arup, where Balmond actually saw a Loricole diagram, used this double corrugation diagram. The desire was to produce this, get rid of the Kohlhasian grid, make self-supporting slabs that wouldn't require a column grid. And they ideally should be infinitely thin and self-supporting. So Balmond suggested this sort of double corrugation structure. In the event, it actually didn't work because there was a desire for very low aspect ratio in the curves of the FOA projects. They couldn't really span that far with such a thin slab structure, and so they had a parting of the ways with Balmond, and then collaborated with a local Japanese engineer, Watanabe, who suggested instead a folded plate logic to the port terminal that was actually built, and that's what they did. They fused the deep folded plates, to the slabs. So I'm getting it's probably a bit convoluted here, but we were very impressed with the ambition of FOA. We felt like, that was really interesting. We wanted to do something with that kind of work, and this was in the Kansai Library, which was the next competition after the Yokohama Port Terminal. But we wanted to do something different. So we approached Israel Sinek, who was also the engineer for the 014 tower, who was a contemporary of Watanabe, and he also came to the decision that it would be a folded plate solution. What distinguishes Sinek's folded plate is that he said, well, if you want to keep the thinness of the continuous surfaces, why don't we make the folded plate a superstructure, just totally separated from the slabs. The FOA project fuses separate folded plates to each slab, but then they get really fat. I guess, so we started this trajectory of work which established the folded plate as a superstructure, and then because the building was in a seismic area, a diagrid that would define the perimeter of the building. And that sort of relationship, one way or another, became part of that lineage that I showed earlier. The next phase. A contemporary, actually a slightly younger engineer, Mitsuru Sasaki, saw the solution of the FOA terminal and said, yeah, I can do better. Clearly the slabs are too fat. We're going to really pursue the continuous kind of structural surface and make it as thin as possible, kind of get back to the ideality maybe of the original FOA scheme and going back to, even OMA. So that would connect to the lineage of work of Toyo Ito and the people that followed him. The Japanese engineers basically solved the single surface problem as a technical problem. But I guess one of the things I would want to point out is that in solving this sort of abstract problem, it may not even be as good architecturally as the more sort of problematic, complex problem. They never really could solve the facade issue, for example. It was always problematic from the start with those single surface projects because they didn't know how to end them. There was an ambition for continuity, and then there was a kind of inbuilt contradiction, which was a true architectural problem, I would say, of, the desire to produce a building that's sort of infinitely continuous, and yet we all know that it can't be. And so that kind of impossible situation is, I would say, a true architectural problem. It's one that's to be celebrated rather than, it's part of the kind of artistic problem of the architect as opposed to a purely sort of technical resolution. You would separate architecture and engineering, in my view. Anyway, I'm getting too far afield, but this, I think, was a really important thing for us to see. We were sort of provoked by it was a piece of institutional critique, in a way, of how the curators wanted to present Japanese architecture, and then what we, who were involved in this whole scene from the 90s, knew what people were doing, what was going on. So yeah, I don't know how I transition into this, but this is an image from The Third Man, which was an aesthetic influence for the Angewandte project. We were really interested in the kind of the picture of Vienna as seen through cinema, and that actually conditioned the way we were kind of thinking through the kind of intensity of the courtyard, the use of the sort of changed horizon and the so-called Dutch angles that were used in cinema. We actually, that was an aesthetic impetus for the project. I mean, aside from structural or systemic, conditions, there were other, culturally interesting things that guided us in that project, which is, I think, typical of the office. I mean, that while we do have an true interest in kind of material and organizational conditions, there are cultural aspects to working in a particular site that we're also interested in engaging, seeing those not as in conflict, but they can actually be worked together. They kind of guide decision making. I also didn't want to have polychrome rendering. I wanted it black and white like the Third Man. So we were insisting on trying to make our renderings like good black and white photographs. Okay, this is another quick thing that happened. It's about interpretations of one's work. And so there was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an American writer and poet and transcendentalist, and I thought it was a fantastic kind of quote. But there was a project recently by Michael Schleich that was really similar. Again, it's sort of this kind of conflict between how an engineer might think of doing a bridge, and at least we as architects interpreting structure, or how to kind of be in the battle between structure and not structure. So I realized that the Schleich Bridge actually was one of the rejected iterations that came from our engineers, that they actually were more interested in kind of essentializing the arch shape. It was actually more efficient, probably, but and it was also deeper. But it was something that we actually battled with Arab on for like 6 months. But formally very similar to ours. The Schleich Bridge, but following more of a kind of conventional engineering logic, I would say. So yeah, kind of encapsulating that, there would be this diagram on the right, which was part of what Arab presented to us, where they would make very discrete and probably very rational decisions about essentializing the arch, and then the network that we were working with would become essentially secondary. There would be the arch and the kind of deck hanging from it, whereas we were trying to kind of spread the forces into the basket weave of our project, have a very gentle arch, and not try to kind of essentialize components in the bridge. So I think that's also part of our sort of working method, that it's not anti-engineering, but that we try to push as hard as we can from an aesthetic and architectural side when we do work with the engineers. This kind of productive tension arises. So in all honesty, probably the scheme for our bridge is not the most sort of optimized and efficient. In fact, I know it wasn't. But it was about working in that tension, between an optimizing logic, or at least a logic for a bridge that would at least stand up, but that would have a different set of architectural effects than what you would find in a purely engineering way. So I'm going to go on now to our 014 tower, which was finished in 2011. And it's a concrete exoskeletal building with a core and an exoskeletal shell, almost like one of those nuclear reactor shells in a way. And it was the sort of kind of, to pull back a little bit, we were involved in a competition prior to that project in one of the sort of monofunctional developments within Dubai. So they have all of these different mini cities, which are in effect islands in the desert in Dubai. They're agglomerated, so they're close, but they basically follow a theme and heavily emphasize a particular program. So our proposal was located in a place called Business Bay. This is just an image of the kind of rapid development of Dubai through the 90s to the early 2000s, and now it's even more developed, but it's really the hotbed of, for a while, of construction, and also a lot of novel proposals. But I would also argue that Dubai, in a sense, because it's a very rapidly growing city, is not so unlike Kuala Lumpur or Shanghai in the sort of character of the urbanism that kind of arises in a city that develops so quickly, and with through global influence, really, more than any sort of purely local influence. So this was when we got involved in the competition, this was the rendering that we were presented with, that was done by Halcro, a big British conglomerate that had a hand in many of the projects. And we were to design a central tower, mixed-use tower, right in the middle of that island. And when we went to the site visit, this is what we saw. So it was really tabula rasa, construction, a master plan that came out of London that was done in a purely speculative manner. And then these were ultimately the design proposals that we were up against. So there was OMA's Dubai Renaissance, which was the rotating slab building, the Zaha Hadid Dancing Towers, which ultimately won that competition, Morphosis's Al Maidan project, and then our Eon Tower. So we lost the competition, but the young developer who ran the competition in Dubai Properties went off on his own, was impressed with our proposal, and then wanted to do this was an 84-story mixed-use tower for the center of that circle. He wanted basically the same formal language reduced to the scale of a 22-story tower that would also be mixed use. So we went through even more than 16 iterations, attempting to kind of bring the formal language into relationship with the scale and the program, and ultimately couldn't do it. It was a completely unworkable scheme. So there was a moment of crisis there, and then we decided to get much simpler with the tower. So there was actually a moment where before we actually got involved in kind of reevaluating the structure and the envelope, where we had a more conventional tower with columns, there was still a little bit of kind of geometrical complexity, more like an alto vase stretched. And at that point, it was mixed use. The market changed while we were doing the design, so residential was to be on top in the thin port of the cruciform, and then it would slowly swell out for office plates. Ultimately, the mixed use went away from the developer, and it was to be purely an office tower. And then we began to rethink what it would mean to do another kind of structure. We were not satisfied with the standard of the kind of curtain wall, highly reflective curtain wall tower that you see in Dubai, and so we kind of put aside the initial scheme, and in consultation with Israel Sinek, our engineer, came up with a much more, I don't know if one would call it radical, but a scheme that would really rethink what it would mean to build in the desert, to use an exoskeletal envelope, both as a brise-soleil and the structure of the building. And so that's what we advanced too. And there would be an analogy, I guess, to the St. Mark's Tower, Frank Lloyd Wright, where his kind of paradigm was more of a kind of tree trunk with trays. What we did was, in some strange way, an inverse of that we put all of the kind of structural mass on the outside and had that do the work, and then have the benefit of that would also mean that the core could actually be fairly light, because most of the sort of lateral forces of wind and seismic would be taken by this exoskeleton shell. Still not the cheapest way of doing it, but architecturally really interesting. So this is notionally what happened. It's not really what happened. So to kind of have the columns migrate outward and instead become the structure of the building. It's always a level of fiction here. But notionally, that's what happened. It didn't happen that way. And it was interesting too. I mean, that then got involved in the very kind of precise relationship between the inside and the outside. There was a lower base building that was part of the scheme, and so in order to connect to a kind of a three-sided base element, which is also part of the requirement of the planning code, we created a series of wells and bridges that allowed those office spaces to connect to the surrounding building. There was also a really terrible moment where the contractor, in an effort to make the construction easier, wanted to see an iteration where the diagrid be turned into a series of Virendell frames. And fortunately, our engineer and we were able to convince him that it was, structurally and aesthetically much better at turning that grid to a diagonal, because it would actually work as a structure as opposed to a series of stacked frames. It also, in appearance, became much more static, and we really couldn't stand it. But luckily, we prevailed, and we used the diagrid as intended. And so, we were looking at a lot of models, from natural forms, and also, structures from bubbles to bone and, various other materials, as well as, work done like the Melnikov house. So there were a number of sort of influences there. And then there were also interpretations that were beyond our control. But this is one of the sort of lower level zones in the building, and then having some resonance with the Melnikov house, actually. So I think what characterizes our way of dealing with material conditions and kind of the visual and aesthetic questions are kind of looked at from a number of different aspects. So on the one hand, especially with the Ofertine Tower, the diagrid is an inherently redundant structure. And so that first image on the upper left comes from the Wellington bomber from World War II, which one of my heroes, Barnes Wallis, designed. And the idea there was that the plane could withstand incredible punishment because there were no essential members. So if it were hit by flak, and they show an Englishman drinking tea, I don't know if you can see that, a whole chunk of the structure is gone, then the forces will find another way to move, and it would still kind of remain intact as an airplane. So while I didn't expect any kind of terrorist attacks on the building, it did give us a tremendous liberty in terms of dealing with closedness and openness in the structure. because we were assured at a certain level that the forces would find their way down, to the ground, and the structure would have integrity. There's also a kind of hidden grid, which you probably can't see, but all of the substructure below ground is actually quite gridded. So there was an aesthetic problem too, that we wanted, we had to track the thick zones that would track down to columns in such a way that they wouldn't be so evident, that we were trying to defeat this sort of determinacy of the grid by producing what Sinek called a trickle-down logic of thickness in the plan, so that the sort of irregularities that you see are a kind of network that slowly, that kind of brings the forces down, but they're not sort of a straight thickening of the diagrid. I may have some iterations. So, long story short, there are, on the one side, kind of material and performative conditions, the sustainable question too, that we were able to produce kind of the building itself is able to cool itself because of the gap between the structure and the window wall. So there's all of those material questions on one side related to performance, and then equally a very strong interest in the aesthetic effects of the building, and that's part of the task, I think, in the project. I like to show this image. This is on the one side, it's the World Trade Center by Les Robertson. Guy Nordenson, who was a colleague at Princeton, had his students do a really careful drawing showing all the alloys that were of steel and strengths that were used in the World Trade Center tower. So it's very interesting as a kind of color gradient, but all of that kind of difference in strength actually was in the service of keeping the appearance of the building totally uniform. So all the members were dimensionally the same, but their strengths were different. And so 014 in a way is a kind of flip on that, where we wanted tremendous heterogeneity or variation. We were varying thicknesses, controlling thicknesses, and even concrete strength while we were working with the engineer through the iterations. So we got a first iteration back with lower strength concrete. There was too little openness, and so we upped the strength of the concrete, and suddenly we gained more freedom in how we manipulated things. So it was a really kind of nice working relationship. To go to the kind of a cultural consequence, there was something that really fascinated me for years, which was a statement by Walter Benjamin about the effect, what he calls the aura. And so one of the kind of prime examples he gives is mountains. And then Mount Fuji is probably like ultra aura in that situation. And so what I kind of perceive more as a kind of an aesthetic phenomenon now is that there's been a kind of inversion that, and I give this as an example, say, of the La Gioconda, Mona Lisa. When you go and visit that, it's somehow, the original is somewhat disappointing because you've seen so much of it in the media. It's become so elevated in a way, dematerialized, that it gains even more authority than this sort of limited, small, old artifact, which everybody goes to, but it gains its actual erratic force in reproduction more than in the original. So I think something has happened. This is my own particular kind of take on things. And so part of the kind of strangeness of these buildings, and I think just because of the technological, it's something that one, in a way, it's not our original invention, but it's something that we are all now participating in, is that there's something of that in operation in actual building projects. So I'm showing here the rendering of 014 on the left. There was a moment in construction when it was unfinished, where it was probably the most material looking. And then when it was finished off, it actually had, in certain respects, the appearance of a built rendering. Which I think is, again, it's an impersonal thing, which is part of the technology that we're all sort of enmeshed in these days, that has somehow bridged the construction, the kind of design and construction process. And so the appearance of the building is, because of that, somewhat uncanny, I would say. Especially, these were early photographs in the context of, Dubai and construction. So because we're working with models that have some connection to a natural form, it has the appearance, in some sense, of being both natural and artificial at the same time, and also, at least in certain viewing, it has an irreality, which is sort of part of the building. This is just getting back to all the variations I talked about earlier. How we make a selection was really about trying to find a pattern that would defeat any easy reading of a diagrid, or any, we were also completely disappointed with the scripted versions that we had in the office, which you could see the rules, they were too obvious. So we actually had to go autopilot with the way in which we kind of dealt with the visual dimension in relation to the structural. It couldn't be automated or turned into an easy set of rules, because the rules were sort of blatantly obvious in the design. There was a very similar sort of frustration that I read actually in a book on music. I'm forgetting the author's name, but anyway, Talking Heads. So if somebody remember. Talking Head, the head of Talking Heads talked about just that kind of thing with the kind of computer-generated music, that the musicians always want to tweak it and move it off of the normative kind of rule set, because it just looks, it's too mechanical. It feels dead. So that was, an aesthetic. That's part of our aesthetic. Plus, kind of cultural interest in things like the Sea of Holes. And so we're interested in a kind of abstraction of the surface, but also that it would also kind of oscillate between being both abstract but also palpable. And kind of another kind of theorization here, but I realized that much of what I was talking about deals in what in school was seen as a kind of aberration. Something like expressionism was seen as a kind of, in a very negative light. How one deals with architectural expression immediately got affiliated with something like structural expressionism. But I think that's where we are. Not that we're doing Calatrava, kind of a super muscular, overpoweringly muscular architecture, but that we are concerned. If modernism can be defined on the left as a skin and bones architecture, and its rational comes from that, we're interested in another territory, which is neither the structural expressionism, say, of Calatrava, or the kind of articulation of the model that separates structure and skin in a more kind of purely rationalized way that you would find in modernism. And so the cosmetic gets really interesting there. In this case, there's a Japanese woman who's putting an artificially large eye into her face, and it doesn't look like an addition. It's just like it naturalizes an artificial imposition. So it's a kind of inclusion. Yeah. It's not a collage, though. And yeah, we were interested in kind of working both with a more elemental form, so the kind of monolithic form of the tower, its simplicity, but then a highly figured surface. And that came from an experience in Rome in the mid-'80s of seeing the pyramid of Cestius and really not knowing how big it was, especially in a very smoggy day. It was scaleless, which I thought was really interesting. It could be really big, or then when you got close to it, it was actually tiny because there was no scale reference. Anyway, I'll move through this quickly. Probably just the kind of anatomy of the tower, 17-story tower, and then there's kind of shows that base. And some of the construction shot, the ring beam at grade. This was the unfolded facade. And so all of those horizontal dashes are actually connections back to the slab. So they're so-called tongue connections because they have to avoid the openings and then tie back. So there's a gap that's developed between the structural facade and then the glazing behind. And then we went through many different sort of explorations about reusing molds, flexible molds, trying to optimize that. At the end of the day, there was a Chinese kind of, the formwork company went away from rubber molds, and basically they were all waste molds. So they were all made of that polystyrene foam that you're all using upstairs in those balls and everything. And they were automated wire cut on site. And so they were all waste molds, which actually meant we could have varied. We only had, I think, 6 different sizes of holes, but in reality, we probably could have had a more infinite number of variations given that technology. But we were looking at different conditions geometrically, where you had zones of flatness versus zones of partial curvature or complete curvature. And this is just a quick kind of overview of the construction process. It was a learning experience, so it took 3 weeks to kind of reach that level because they were really trying to figure out how to do this building, how the contractor, how to locate the formwork, and even strengthening the formwork. This is one of the examples of the waste mold that smashed out with a sledgehammer. And then this is, to go to the environmental envelope. The stack effect actually had a major influence on, it was a byproduct, honestly, of the scheme, which we then, refined, because it was not the first thing that we were thinking about, but then we were working with the environmental engineers. They told us that we could actually reduce the amount of air conditioning substantially in the building, both with the sunscreen and that gap, between facade and the glazing level. So that's, more or less, how it works. And there's actually a substantial wind at the bottom of the building because of that stack effect. There's always a breeze, which makes, being outside, especially in the summertime, somewhat tolerable. And this is a view of the roof with the exoskeletal shell exposed, those bridges and how they penetrate. This lower space was really a kind of avenue out to the waterfront. So the idea was not to produce a solidified base, but to actually make the building a kind of gateway to a waterfront esplanade. So that's how we had to argue actually with the city planning people, because they had a more British, set of codes, and they expected that it would be a solid base. But we argued for super elevating what would have been a base element and make that open and buried the parking level. Typically what they do is put parking around these areas. And that's a gap from bottom of building to top. And in the lobby, it pulls back, so the gap widens and actually, becomes a more substantial outdoor space before you get to the inside. And we designed the reception desk, had some influence, although we didn't design the interior. We did design the kind of ceiling finishes and so forth, so we didn't choose that furniture. It was not what I would actually have wanted the raw concrete like this, which would be more like what I remember, some of the buildings here in Buenos Aires were like the stadium. I would have loved to have this, but in Dubai they want everything to look perfect. Okay, so I'm moving on to the Taipei Pop Music Center, which is currently about a year and a half away from total completion. But it was this project and the other project were started as planning projects before they were really architectural. So we had to come up with a master plan and deal with focus first on the urban situation and then on particular works of architecture. And it was to be understood as a kind of island in the fabric, that there would be a really distinct difference because it was dedicated to pop music, both the kind of production and performance, that the identity of this complex should not look like the fabric around it. I mean, in fact, the fabric around it was mainly a factory area, so they wanted to tear most of those factories down, but rather that this would be a kind of an island neighborhood. It was to be both for pop production and performance, but also had to work as civic spaces and park in times when there weren't musical performances. So the very opposite of, say, a stadium project, where it's either open or closed. Here it was supposed to, there were shops and plazas and the kind of major elements of the project were to be integrated in the kind of with the nearby residential towers and things that they're planning in the future. But it was to have a very distinct visual identity. That was almost in the brief. So yeah, the intent of this overall, it was a kind of move by the Taiwanese government to finally recognize their pop music industry. Their industry was among the first after the Japanese, and they are under pressure from the pop music cultures of Korea, of Japan, and now kind of growing one in China. So there was a real push to recognize their industry and to foreground it and actually to make it visible in some way architecturally. So this project, even in the brief, really emphasized not only how the thing worked locally, but it actually had to be, in a sense, photogenic. It had to be an iconic project so that if you saw it, you would know it was Taipei Pop. That was one of the imperatives that we didn't invent, but that was sort of really much, very much part of the brief. So it's as much about how it looks on television as it is about its performance as, in real life. That people would see it on television and know what they were, looking at. So that had to be considered. The other thing was, from our point of view, we really wanted to be clear that this would not be a venue or a place that would shut down. So we even went through a kind of exercise about how various portions of the project could be used over a certain time period, both inside and outside. And that was also presented to the city more at the level of the planning scheme, the ambition of the planning scheme, that it not just be a closed piece of architecture, but a piece of urbanism. So this is an image of a later scheme with the outdoor public amphitheater. So that's a kind of plaza space for outdoor performance. And then in this rendering, the main hall, which is a 5,000 seat hall. Then the industry shell, which is really more about production of music and technical facilities. Then there's a cube, which is a museum, a Hall of Fame and museum. All of these we strategize this as a new datum in the city. It would all be elevated. Bridges are already part of how Taipei works. A level of pedestrian bridges in Taipei establishes a datum, and we figured we would create a new kind of landscape in a way with groundwork, and fabric would be even like the kind of this lower zone is shopping and restaurants and so forth around a plaza. That would form a kind of groundwork, and then there would be object architectures that would sit on that groundwork, and it would orient you within the complex. So the two crystalline forms and the cubic form kind of sit above that horizon. So this is the kind of overall schematic view. There's also a very large, it's two sites actually joined by one of those pedestrian bridges. So we enlarged that, connected this one site with the 5,000 seat theater, and then the long site with the kind of open plaza. There are two different nightclubs of various scales in the lower zones, as well as shopping and restaurants there. They can close this plaza off for ticketed performances, but then the rest of the day it's really open. It's a more normal piazza plaza, and then it continues with the park. And then that, as I said, that top, this element is the kind of Hall of Fame and museum. So that's one of the sectional views of it. Rendering, kind of night rendering, and the kind of shopping mode, I guess. Some details of that Hall of Fame facade. So circulation in this museum happens mainly, one goes up to the top and then circulates down through the facade. And there would be a kind of timeline of the history of pop in the staircase. And then this is the hall. This is the main hall. Here, we were really working with this kind of problem where we felt that the kind of proportion of the hall was too high. So the ground line actually intersects the lower zones of this. So the kind of deep constructed groundwork. This actually contains, and I'll show this later, like the press rooms and all of that. So the building is partially sunken, in a sense, into this built groundwork. And the whole main hall is kind of a nested series of layers. So there's a kind of outer folded layer. Down here, the kind of pedestrian bridge becomes particularized into all the salons and connections outside of the performance space. So the infrastructure goes from outside to inside. And then there's a kind of inner crystal, which is the kind of panelized surface of the performance space of the hall. So it's a kind of nested series of layers. And this is the physical model and the kind of cross-section of, so there's parking below the main hall. They use this. That's also another thing. This is not, it's 5,000 seats, but it's not meant for, let's say, if U2 comes to Taiwan, they're going to do their performance in a stadium. This is actually it's a middle-sized venue, more for rolling out new groups and local performers, but also the main audience is really aimed at mainland Chinese from the mainland who will visit Taipei. Those are the people they're aiming at to be a major audience, in this project. So this is the area where they would have red carpet events. It's below the bridge line. It's at the lowest level. And this is an aerial photograph early on, and then how the building got, a few months ago in construction from Google Earth. The structural state, and then with the cladding and the detailing, also all the corrugated, sort of, not corrugated, but standing seam details were a challenge, as was the glazing. That's what we call the mothership view. So there's a whole other kind of service-related zone, which I don't show, you can't really see in this picture, but all of the servicing of the main hall happens below grade, and everything is sort of, all of the trucks and all of the equipment go into that lower zone below the level of this mounded up surface. It hasn't yet been planted, but it masks those kind of elements. It's at another level in the section. This is a view, out of one of the mounds on the side, which contains the press room. So there's a kind of vault-like space, which once it gets cleared will kind of extend from front to back. And that's for interview spaces and the press. And then this is one of the views from the lobby of the glazing. Yeah, I mean, my interest in aircraft kind of extends to some of the kind of formal language here, because we were looking at World War II British goggles that are faceted as a kind of inspiration for how to kind of produce the corrugated glazing. And they're slowly building the folded surface of the acoustical layer in the auditorium. And that's a somewhat earlier shot of the structure and of the roof with the decking on it before putting on the standing seam. So there is also a kind of resonance to the landscape around the building. And so that was also one of the surprises, that in a way it is contextual, but what seems to be happening is that it makes the buildings around it look like they should be torn down. It nests very well in the natural landscape in Taipei, and has, in a way, it's somewhat aggressive to the kind of older, fabric and factories around it. So this is a view of that ground, kind of elevated ground, and Nanako's, my partner, is standing looking at us. So that, we are arguing now to have that become an elevated public space above the plaza. I mean, it's available. But yeah, we'll see if we succeed in making that an accessible space, because it's actually quite abstract and interesting to be up there. So yeah, from the rendering to the structure to where we are now with the project. Okay, I'll move on to Kaohsiung Port Terminal. Again, it's a, it was a very large, it began as a planning project, and it was intended to be the tower for the port of authority of the industrial city of Kaohsiung. So there are kind of civic port functions that happen in the tower, and then the lower lobes are part of the cruise ship terminal for both cruise ships, fast ferries, and then local boats. So there's like 3 different programs, for the different scales of ships that would service this facility. And it's part of an overall sort of project by the city of Kaohsiung, not to replace the industry, it's not post-industrial, but to overlay public space all along the harbor edge with a public accessible layer. And so, yeah, these are some of the projected cruise routes, both from Japan and also from the mainland and China. Again, it's more an East Asian group who would use and be part of the network of facilities. Probably would connect also to Yokohama port terminals, my friends at FOA. And the idea at one level was actually quite simple, that we would keep the ground related to the industry and service. The terminal would occupy, in a way, a middle ground, and then there would be a kind of elevated public esplanade along the edge of the harbor that we wanted, to continue, and that would link a whole series of programs. That's been partially successful. We can only control what we can control, but that's the concept that the industrial port would continue to operate, but that you could have this overlay of recreational and public programs right above it. And so schematically, this was the kind of planning diagram that we presented in a way prior to any architecture that would go in. And its connections to the shopping district and to other, buildings along the edge. And so notionally, and not notionally, but those abstract layers actually concretely become the major sectional differences in the project. So the blue is an elevated public esplanade that then feeds commercial programs that are in the lobes of the building. They're higher than the cruise ship terminal. So there are restaurants and shops above the level of the cruise ship layer. And then there's a kind of middle layer, which is really more properly related to the going out to the ships. Those are the gantries to the ships. And then the tower, in a sense, nestles into that ground, into that kind of shaped, deformed ground. So we saw the project as a kind of manifold. This is a kind of, one of the logics was that when you enter the kind of terminal, you would actually see all of the directions you could possibly go to, from the tower to each of the 3 connections out to the ships. So it's, in a way, very central organizationally. So instead of a gridded sort of plan, it became more like a manifold or a piece of a machine part that you would enter here, and then you would actually be able to see all these different directions of highly figured space, and use poché in such a way that we could basically pack all of the vertical circulation in between the walls so that the volumes of the space would be relatively clear. You wouldn't have too many applied staircases or elevators. All of those would be between the walls rather than, and also all the HVAC and everything else. And those actually grew in thickness as we developed the project, from the competition to the final building. And sort of there's an outflow if you approach the building to go to ships and so forth, and then an inflow at a higher level from the public walkway, which is what those arrows show. But it really works like an airport section, actually. I mean, the drop-off happens at an elevated level, and then disembarkation means you go down and are picked up on a lower level. So very much like, sectionally, like an airline terminal. So yeah, this is, let me see myself. This is, yeah, first floor level, mainly dealing with that's a disembarkation level. And then the main level, which brings people more directly out to the ships at the end bar. And then it was very much about trying to develop a three-dimensional sense of the space and of simultaneity, of being able to look up wells and see what was happening and see down into garden spaces. And that gives you more of an idea of the kind of what happens in the poché space. There's an auditorium at the base of the tower as well. Their ambition was to really also make it a 24-hour space so that it would be active when ships weren't in port. So a lot of the programming, the restaurants, the shopping, and all of that, were really an integral part of the project. And so this is a view from that esplanade and the section. So there's, kind of esplanade level restaurants here and shopping, and then higher level restaurants as well. And we had to keep those populations separate from people who are ticketed and going to ships. So that was a real challenge as well. So you could look in, but you wouldn't be a ticketed passenger, but still experience the space. So Ciro mentioned this. This was kind of interesting material history of the site. Before we could even start building, they discovered that there was literally a lake of oil under the site, because this site has continuously been occupied first by the Japanese and the Imperial Japanese Navy from the 1920s up to 1945. It was a tank farm. And then after the war, the tank farm for oil was rebuilt by China Petroleum, so that really was toxic. The ground was literally a lake. So I actually found targeting images by the U.S. Navy and Air Force during World War II, where they bombed that tank farm, Mitsubishi tank farm, and even found the photographs of the actual raid from aircraft carriers. So there's an incredible sort of built-in material history that we had to confront in a quite literal way on this site. And also, its status continuously as a port, as a kind of rough space. Much of the steel was prefabricated. We worked again with the same engineer as 014 Tower. It was his last project. He died before we presented the competition, actually. Israel Sinek, who was a Cuban engineer, a fantastic guy. And as opposed to Taipei Pop, the structure basically remained unchanged from competition to the actual building. So I'm going to go down to I showed this in the show, but we also do very small scale work. That's actually the heritage of the office. My mother is an architect who was a mid-century modernist, so we were trained by her, actually both Nanako and I, to do highly detailed work down to, what they used to do all the time was even design the silverware. So this was an apartment with design on Park Avenue where the owner was a ceramicist, and so we custom designed every bit of hardware for the project. And the egg fit into the kind of neoclassical scheme of the apartment. It was a wall-based architecture. We would normally want to go with an open plan, but it was forbidden. So we actually had to kind of delve into a peculiar sort of development out of a classical dome. We thought that would be very interesting. A foyer, very commonly is a domed space in these apartments. And so we said, well, why don't we just extend the walls down? That will be a reflector and hold the collection, and it would kind of enclose all the work and protect the work. So these are the drawings of all of the metal work, and then we had very skilled Italian craftsmen build the compound curvatures. So it was. It was a kind of an egg-like form, but probably sectionally more like an Airstream trailer. And then all of the portals, all of the cuts, some of which are oblique, some of which are more normal to the surface, kind of reveal the poché. We also had a lot of fun. There's the kind of Airstream section. So a lot of these sort of shelf-like elements were not really to put anything on, but more like niches that would reflect and kind of enclose the work. And there were actually two shells which merge at the two axes at the ends and smooth into one another. And then an elaborate, a solid wood door, which we were able to mill all the way through. So that's not a metal thing, that's a wood door that we sort of pushed the technology because the milling people didn't want to do this with hardwood, but we were able to convince them. One of the funny sort of byproducts of that, which we totally didn't anticipate, was that it increased the surface area of the solid wood door so much that it expanded like crazy in the summertime. And so it had to be shaved down after the first year. They had to go back and remove material so that it wouldn't completely lock up. But I'm sure it was because the increase in surface area. And then the last project I'm going to show was a kind of speculative project that we were invited to do by the Hong Kong, it was a Hong Kong pavilion at this year's Biennale. And everyone was asked to do a tower, and we were actually given a very limited number of footprints with which to work with, and the height and footprint we had to respect. And so we argued for a somewhat generic tower, but that would answer a pressing social need actually in Hong Kong, that there's an increasing kind of split between working people, middle class, and the very wealthy. So one of the, I don't know if it's probably a more utopian ambition, but would be to develop a tower where you would accommodate all three, like three different classes of people, and that there would be different scales of residence within the tower. And then the egg, actually the work on the egg that we did in the apartment was sort of what inspired us to think of those egg-like spaces as public spaces. Also connects to traditional Chinese gardens, the kind of weightless space. So the idea too is that the inhabitants wouldn't normally want to deal with each other, but they kind of the radical ambition would be to thrust them into an architecture that was so foreign that they would begin to engage one another because they wouldn't be in a normative context. So we go through, different types. It's basically an L-shaped plan, predominantly circulation and elevators on one side of the L, and then apartments in the other. So it's a big egg crate, kind of gridded egg crate with these included elements, three-dimensional elements, that could either be private or be public, depending upon how they intersect. And that there would be three basic zones sectionally that would, in a way, stand for the courtyards that you would find laterally in the city. So people would walk to those eggs a short distance. They would take their elevators up, but then there would be common spaces in the section, 3 zones of them, where there would be the possibility of shared spaces. So the middle income, and then the lower income. Lower income, and actually we realized that there was still enough space. We looked at the most micro living in Hong Kong, and these are actually bigger. That thinner strip on the left is actually still bigger than the most minimal space that people live in Hong Kong. So we began to populate what was originally just a circulation bar. So this is the model. It wasn't ever fully developed, more a concept. The model was done totally remotely by Hong Kong U students. We sent laser cutting files and they stacked it all together. But yeah, this gives you an idea of those zones and then the mix of inhabitants in a zone. And this was in Venice, the model, and then also an idea, probably more kind of related to the 60s, of being able to move those pods up and down using a crane, so that apartments and partitions could be fitted out in different ways in a more generic space. And advertising for our upcoming book. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Oh, it's actually... Okay, I was planning to walk there, but...
Wow. Went very long. I apologize. I knew it.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Jesse, for such a generous presentation. I would prefer to move into the questions of the audience. So, how are you going to do to bring the microphone? Do you manage? Yeah, you have a load.
I have a question.
Yes.
In relationship with your notion of interior, because in one project, the O14, I wanted to ask you, because you showed us a picture of the torso of a bodybuilder.
Oh yes, yes.
And then a picture of someone very bony.
Right.
Yes. And I would put okay, the question is, why does not the interior relate with the skin of the building?
I think it does, actually. I mean, I didn't go into that, but one of the ambitions, actually, of the O14 building, and I didn't go into the office arrangement, and actually, we were mainly ignored, I would say, by the tenants. But one of the sort of, I wouldn't even call it utopian ambitions, but it was one of the things we were trying to do was that the envelope of the building as opposed to, say, the Inland Steel building or a Mies building where you would have a uniform facade, that the variation in openness or darkness would actually have an effect on how you organize an office space. So I didn't include that in the presentation, but yeah, that was actually, it would be like a tropic logic, like, you know, because people would question, well, why aren't the windows the same size, you know, what? But it was actually more that there would be a kind of relationship possible to set up between, you know, darkness and light and how it might affect office organization. Also because it would feed into what is currently happening, where you wouldn't, say in the 1950s building, files and paper actually determine as much about the layout of those offices, you know, as the people. That because there was just such a mass of that. But as the technologies get lighter and data storage becomes more light, one could radically reconsider, and people are doing this, of course, you know, radically consider what the environment of an office might be. So some people are going to the park model or a restaurant model or a cafe model. We didn't get so much involved in that because it was a spec office building, but we did have an idea that the variability would actually have an effect on how people arrange their desks and offices, you know, which wouldn't be so regulated and normative. So yeah, that would be my answer to you. Yeah. It didn't happen. I mean, this is the problem for all architects, I think, that certain things are simply out of your control. So, you know, a tenant does what they want to do, and it's not something that you can over-determine either. And they'd hire their own interior decorators for better or worse, but that was the ambition. Yeah.
That you mentioned at the very end, the uncanniness and that condition that you have. And I was wondering if that was kind of something that happened with the tower, or what is the agenda, like more transversally in terms of the semiotics that you're actually in the workshop talking a lot about?
Yes,
if there is something transversal.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did connect it in an essay to the peculiar placelessness of these cities, especially Dubai and cities like that, where there really isn't a local architecture. It's more inherently, I don't know if you would even call it cosmopolitan, but it's more it appears more universally around the world. And so one of the formulations was that there should be an architecture that somehow responds in another way than modernism to this strange, like, place, no place condition. Because on the one hand, it still is a place. On the other hand, it's so affected by, you know, developments and technologies and, you know, all of the other things that, you know, that begin to upset a very settled idea of what context is. But also how to do it architecturally. What are the limits that, I don't know, strictly speaking, architecture can do with this? I have colleagues who are much more invested in new media. I'm probably a conservative on that. You know, I begin to make distinctions between that and the work of a piece of architecture. And so I think the ambition is to try to kind of negotiate that in strictly architectural terms, or what I would call strictly architectural terms.
I mean, in a way, along the lines of the question, I was wondering if you think that there is a moment where the architecture of the office sort of deviated from initial from the first decade, I would say, like in the mid 2000s. Well, you showed the image of SpongeBob.
Right.
Of 14.
Right.
So if there is any, I mean, how do you see the role of figuration in the work? And if the role of figuration has changed along the years, and if anything, if it has changed around that period, you know, beyond the SpongeBob jokes, let's say. But I remember you being sort of perplexed and at the same time interested in that moment.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you think that there is a change in the role of figuration in relationship to the way you treat form, basically, work.
Honestly, I think there are a lot of elements of very, very early work in the current work. I think one of the things that probably we're appreciating more, I mean, if there's something like, you know, for example, the Kaohsiung Port Terminal is full-blown figurality, I would say, right? It's, you know, but it's also large enough to be able to, in its scale, that it sort of relates to have an urban scaled figurality or infrastructure as well. Although there are, you know, blatantly sculptural dimensions to the building, no doubt. But it's large enough, I think, to be able to kind of negotiate those issues in a very particular way, as opposed to, I don't know, a smaller scale thing. But that's something, also, this is something that I noticed in actually traditional Japanese architecture, which is something that we were after both in the Pop Music Center and to a certain extent in Kaohsiung, that the figurality or even the sense of style is more evident in reproductions. So if you see pagoda roofs, they become stylistic and calligraphic and so forth in reproduction or in a drawing, but in reality they produce something else, which I can't exactly get my finger on, but that they have more of a kind of telluric presence. You don't see style in the same way that when it's photographed. And so I think that's also been a real interest of ours, since we're getting more involved in building what the effects are when you're encountering it as opposed to, you know, seeing an image of it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah. So, yeah.
I would like to know how your team works during the design process and construction of the project. And maybe then what's your role in
Yes. We're a very small office, so there isn't a normal division of labor. I think, you know, when everybody is involved with the competition, I mean, I'm drawing and model making at the same time, you know, we're kind of engaging the people around us. I also, you know, go in and act probably as a provocateur when people are designing stuff, like kind of pushing them to do more or to, you know, kind of guiding the development that way. And, you know, I think a lot of times people want me to leave the room because I'm actually slowing things down and it's not being productive. So it's, you know, both good and bad, but I think, you know, Nanako and I, you know, have worked so closely together for so many years. It practically there's not much verbal communication, I would say. You practically don't have to speak. I know what's going on with her, especially because, you know, I can see it on her face, or she'll just draw something and raise her eyebrows, and then I will be silent. So there's an internal sort of in a good situation. There's a kind of productive competition in a way, but it's a very small, you know, group. It's like a boutique scale group. So then we shift over, when we're actually involved, we're first of all using executive architects, local architects who actually have much larger sort of production resources in all cases in this, in these projects. So that was also a kind of lesson, because I remember getting people at SOM really shocked, because I think that's also just true of the technology now, that you don't need an army of people working on a project. You actually can work with a very good group of designers, a very small good group of designers can do really large projects. I mean, as long as you have this other, resource, with a larger kind of corporate production firm. But we're constantly having to correct, and the Taipei firm, who was one of the oldest ones, were not the most expert in 3D modeling. Everything had to be converted to AutoCAD, to flat plans, and they would evaluate only the plan section or the section they were working on. They had no idea that it was changing continuously. So there's a constant back and forth that happens every day with those projects, every night, checking their drawings and pushing it back, and then also negotiating the contractors' complaints and fielding constant changes.
Actually, continuing with that question,
yes.
How do you relate, or how do you compare the way you work in the office and the way you teach, particularly the way you have been performing these days?
Yes, I mean, I think to a certain extent it's similar, but I think there's less discussion, actually. I think people are already focused on what they're doing, so there wouldn't be a kind of it wouldn't be like a desk crit, and there wouldn't be any, we don't do variations, actually, and we don't sort of do versions and then talk about it. We usually converge on one thing and then go for it. There isn't that. Like at SOM, they all have the principals go into the room, and then junior designers will do competitive schemes or something, and then they would discuss and choose. But for us, we don't really actually do that. And we really, there's always a problem with a client who's insisting on variations. Because we actually only are really invested in one at the end of the day. So while the computational mechanisms produce tons of variations, we don't really, for the most part, we don't use them. I mean, usually there's a much faster convergence on what we're after.
Does it make your dialogue with the clients harder, or how does it?
No, I mean, that's more of a corporate thing. I mean, I think also these particular things were competitions, so the clients were out of it, right? I mean, these were presented to international juries, and then the clients were confronted with a design that had already been approved. So that creates its own complications, but there weren't in those initial phases ever variations. Although, I mean, when that Taipei Pop project that I showed was not the competition scheme. It was radically altered when the pop music industry went on board. So they insisted on almost doubling the size of the theater. They didn't there was a robot. I mean, I can show you not now. But there was a completely different scheme for competition, and then for what we ultimately did.
I have a question about going back to the formal discourse.
Yes.
It seemed that each of the projects you showed, there was something different in each of the projects in terms of how the more normative aspects of the architecture relate to the more exceptional.
Yes.
In some projects there was more of a collision or opposition, and other projects was more about everything being sort of exceptional.
Right.
So I was wondering if if you think that kind of relationship is contingent to each project, and you're interested in that mode of working, or if you have a preference for a more ideological, idiosyncratic way of organizing these things.
I couldn't answer that one simply. I think we in various degrees have engaged with both. And I think it's based really on the kind of circumstance. I mean, the last thing I showed was, highly determined by a pre-given, the L-shaped tower and the grid. One of the ideological things that I was toying with was like, well, how would this project be the same or different from the older modernisms? I haven't answered it yet, but it was also like the first time I actually had to confront a project which was predominantly, in a way, normative, which interests me. Yeah. So, yeah, how to deal with that. I always resisted it, but then ideologically we were arguing for a universal space that would be continuously different. But this goes back to a much earlier form of modernism where you have a kind of dialectic between, what can you say?
Regarding the Atlas of Nomad Tectonics, that mainly focuses on relationships between materials and organization.
Yes.
Mainly.
Yes.
And this kind of thing that you showed at the beginning, the legacy and the discipline and working with the work of others and that stuff. How do you position in this novel tectonic? Do you consider that you are investigating these novel tectonics? How do your projects show that tension between engineers and how to stretch that? Can you speak about that relationship? And,
sure.
And another one, the next book is like under consequences.
Right.
I'm interested in that, and the other aspect that you mentioned, like material organization and culture. Like I suppose culture introduces in consequences.
That's a lot to answer. I hoped I explained some of that in the lecture, but I guess my simple answer to the first question would be that it would go back in a certain sense to the crude type argument in the Atlas. So if the legacy of work from others would fit into, say, like the continuous surface, we wanted to engage the continuous surface project that started with REM and passed through all these other people. We thought we could do something else with it. Then the material and geometrical approach would be engaging a kind of crude typology that came from this legacy, but doing it differently. I guess that would be, I don't know if that's my simple answer. I mean, that there was a kind of myth and a desire. It was really based on a strange desire by all these architects to produce an infinitely thin topological space that, could connect everywhere, and I don't know, it was partly, and would look boundless. There would be effects of boundlessness either by, running the walls and the ceilings and the floors together. There was a whole panoply of effects that was somehow part of the common desire. And then we were critical, not in a kind of negative way, but we say, well, what's the problem with the FOA project? They can't end it. They can't, that there are kind of problematics. They are dealing with an abstracted surface, but there isn't that much variety in terms of what actually happens on it. it's highly abstract on the one hand, and desire that, but on the other side of it, there's our desire, I guess, for diversity within the abstraction. So there are all of these things, so we were actually looking at terrain, literal landscape design in relation to the surface instead of an ideally smooth surface, things like that too. I mean, how or how program would work in even more concrete ways on surfaces like that. So yeah. So yeah, I don't know. That would be to bring those interests to bear on an already prevailing tendency in the discipline would be the answer. I can't remember what the other questions were made.
Regarding culture and consequences.
Yeah, that I've been bringing up all week. I think there's a tendency. Many of you have been are already imbued with a very systematic way of working, and with ways in which you can manipulate parameters in the designs, and then there's always that then results in many different kinds of variations. But then what are the criteria for choosing those variations? And so what I was suggesting was that, well, then you can't, within the strictly systematic point of view, many times beyond, say, engineering, I don't know, or some sort of quantitative evaluation, it's very hard to say what's right or wrong. So my sort of answer was, well, since you're dealing with the theater, there are other cultural things going on, and those would allow you to converge on a particular attitude towards the cultural consequences of the work, which would allow you to kind of make a decision on how it would be developed. Also, some implicit critique of Mies, like, well, if Mies does this, and I want to kind of be both respectful, but at the same time think of another way forward. That would also be more of a kind of critical, productive, critical, cultural evaluation rather than a purely on a materialist, systemic one. So that's how, I have been looking at it. Yeah, so it's another discourse, but it's not really contradictory. I think it's just a completely different sort of vector of focus on the same work.
Hello, I wanted to... along the presentation, you mentioned several times the theatrical condition of the projects, like the first project. And first I wanted to ask you, how do you think this theatrical condition of the projects has been evolved along these years, like from the first project that you showed till the last one? And if you, inside the office, if you develop systems which measure these theatrical conditions the same way you showed the diagrams of the structure, or the stress structure of the facade, the O40, or maybe not that way, but like if there are any
systemic?
No, not systemic, like mediums that you use to which the project is tested into the theatrical. Maybe it's an image like you showed in the first one. But
right.
Mediums that you use inside the office. They do not need to be systemic.
Right. I'm trying to think. Obviously the kind of image from film was one for Angewandte. It really varies. I think most of the provocations, in a way, culturally, would either come from an architectural legacy that we might be engaging, or from the particular form of, in a way, theatricality or public, I don't even know if it's really theatricality is the right word, but there's like, with the Angewandte, it's public ritual, which in a way was theatrical. I mean, the whole Ringstrasse in a way was a form of theater in the city. And so, and the rituals of showing a piece of art, or, you know, when you would do it, would relate to politics and theater, I guess. You know, I mean, for example, and I guess I should be clear, the prompt actually was a reaction to the Diller Scofidio Renfro Metropolitan project. I really hated the idea that the public should see people practicing. Like that was somehow going to teach you anything. So I thought it would be better to go to a 19th century model and say, like, when you're practicing, you're not, you know, there's a particular moment when art is performed, and it's not about amusing the public, about, you know, showing ballerinas doing their stretches and they can sort of be voyeurs. So that, you know, relates even to museums. I mean, to museum design, like, you know, the Breuer Museum in New York is deliberately, it's literally, you know, the old Breuer is a castle with a moat. And there's a very particular idea, which I kind of find interesting too, that it isn't a fully open museum, but that it's sort of protecting the art from the street. So there would be different degrees of that, but I was kind of getting tired of the kind of elaboration of this mixing everything and actually losing the articulation of culture in doing that. Not that I was a fascist, but it's more that you actually lose the cultural articulation. It's like, you know, I'm going to take the hors d'oeuvres and the main course and the dessert, and I'm just going to throw them out on the table. There's actually a really good thing about ritual and, I don't know, and how that connects to how we live. It further articulates things rather than just saying everything is the same, and yeah. So it wasn't a matter of, I don't know, extending that to a politics is another question. I mean, that's not to say that, you know, everything should be separated and articulated at the level of public policy. It's more about cultural behavior. But my, you know, critical theorists at Princeton would immediately tell me that, I guess, that I'm displaying fascist tendencies or anti-democratic tendencies because whatever happens, you know, to the meal would also happen in public space or would happen in government, which I don't, you know, I don't subscribe to. So, yeah.
Hi, Jesse.
Yeah.
I was wondering when you show the patterns of the tower.
Yes.
And in one particular moment you said, and some of these we didn't selected them because you said it differently, but you said something like because you could tell which were the rules at play.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and
you know, that was with the David Byrne quote too. Yeah, that he. You know.
Yes. And maybe you said something before in different answers.
Yes.
But I was wondering about that. How do you think about those not so small decisions? Like not only how do you choose, but how do you think? What do you think about choosing? And maybe if it has something to do with novelty, maybe or if there is a relationship there. Or
Well, I don't know. With those gradients, yeah. I mean that. We attempted to do the scripted gradients, for example, and you could the problem was actually that there were the rule. What we wanted would entail writing scripts that were so localized that it was absurd. And so the guy who was working on Roland Snooks, who was really good, basically said he came to the conclusion that we were really interested in randomness because as we moved around that pattern, we wanted to continuously defeat any clear reading of a trend that was obviously kind of overly systematically deployed. So he really tried actually to isolate areas, and then it became insane because he had to keep changing the rules every few centimeters. And so it was actually easier to make those adjustments more getting off autopilot, I guess. The thing was that all of it would work. Like we were dealing with except in an extreme situation, the structure was so redundant anyway that practically anything in terms of the pattern would actually function. So function didn't really help. Like there couldn't be a reliance on on the engineering of the thing, because the more the concrete strength got pumped up, the closer we could get from one hole to the other. I mean, there were also limits in terms of laying reinforcement and all of that kind of stuff in terms of actually building this thing. But there was a tremendous amount of freedom, so within a system that could already absorb a lot. But it was more about how it was read, I guess, how it was perceived.
On that line, I had a question about the David Byrne thing, and about how automated computerized things needed
tweaking
sensibility, I would say, in a way. And I was thinking that probably the Atlas of Novel Tectonics or the production of theory was operative in that way in the work, in the sense that a lot of the outcome of maybe the computerized of the 90s worked really well in the Atlas, but without mentioning computers. Like it was a very sensible way of making that operative, but I think it was operative in a much broader sense in architecture, in the sense that you don't need computers to produce certain to think in that logic. I was thinking about the production. How do you deal with when you have to write something, when you need to theorize, and how that, and if the new book has something of that, or that sensibility?
Well, definitely I would subscribe to Peter Cook in that way. I mean, like that actually you need to do the work. It's all, I mean, I don't see post-rationalizing as bad. It's actually necessary. And that most of what you discover should come out of what you're doing. And then it doesn't really matter what the kind of timeline of the decision is. I mean, we're part of the black box crew, so we don't really argue for, there's a whole group at Columbia that we decided that you couldn't justify your project through the process. It would be about the product, and then there would be a way of retrospectively understanding by getting the feedback from the process of what happened and how it could possibly be then theorized in a future work. But you need the work. You need to sort of get some information back from what you do instead of I don't know, purely a priori trying to think what it would be, because it's always different from what you thought it was anyway. But I don't know if that answers your question, but that's most of the writing happens in reaction either to teaching or you know, from doing something and then speculating on it.
I have a question, Jesse, over here, to your right, all the way to your right.
I don't know where the, yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I wanted to ask you about something that you do in your work, and you also did tonight, that is to avoid categories in a way that commonplaces categories. Like you maybe use form finding, but you don't talk about that, or you maybe use like an excessive formalism, but you don't talk about that, or you are embedded in the digital, but you don't talk about that.
Embedded in the what?
In the digital. Like some called digital architecture maybe, or some excess of that.
Right.
So I was thinking about how do you, if you can elaborate in a way to not to categorize, but maybe to explain what place do you think your practice occupies in a map of global practices today. Just in the same way that you avoid categories, like how do you see your practice in today global practice?
I see. Well, you're covering a lot of categories, so there would probably have to be a diagram to show overlaps. You know, but some of them are technological practices or uses. Some of them are cultural predilections or historic legacies. I mean, certainly we're using digital technology, and certainly we're using form finding. Although probably in most cases we're sort of I would say both with the digital technology and with, say, the form finding, for example. The sort of the architectural will is probably, if I, to be quite honest about it, architectural will would trump, I hate to use trump, but architectural will would override the imperative, say, of being strictly digital, or the form-finding model. There's already a predisposition and a will to form, which would then frustrate any pure sort of registration, say, of, I don't know, an account of a purely rigorous digital process that leads to a result. Or, like I showed with all those Alishan bridges, there were the form-found versions that actually the structural engineers sent us, and we hated them. And we're constantly at battle, I think. I don't know if I'm answering your question exactly, but the categories which are then sort of purified, like Axel Killian, my colleague, is always annoyed at me, because Axel wants everything to devolve into systems and scripts in the most precise way. And basically, ours would probably be more of kind of primitive hacking of those orthodoxies, because we are after something that we want. Not that I care about hacking anything or abusing anything, but it's more that there's a will to achieve something, which probably comes from an older tradition of drawing. And then all of those technologies, one way or another, as pure things, fall short, or they force you to kind of go into another area to get what you want. So yeah, I guess it would require an expert to kind of look at what we're doing and kind of prize apart the overlaps. But in practice, I think most of the design desires seem to kind of push beyond the normative definitions of one category and another, I think. I mean, even at the very earliest thing when we were working on really early computer programs that were from Canada. For example, they couldn't ever kind of produce a sharp corner because it was built into the program. And so I had to kind of trick it or go manual, and in order to kind of achieve what we wanted and not see the program as a virtue. It was a tool, but which was inadequate. Adequate in certain things and inadequate in others, but yeah.
I will going to close, but I want to ask another question, which is, how do you think that your formation as an architect in Cooper Union and Cranbrook have influenced this, even, for example, what you are saying now? Like,
I mean, I think there was profoundly, I would say that there is sort of there was a really amazing cross-section of professors who crossed kind of my path at Cooper Union, you know, from Haydock to Aldo Rossi, Raymond Abraham, Peter Eisenman. They were all there and all had very different sort of attitudes to architecture that, you know, one way or another would inform the work. Just because of their presence, I would say Libeskind was probably the greatest influence, was not at the level of form, but at the level of process. I mean, what I'm saying is probably closer to Libeskind, just in terms of how to operate, not in terms of what he does. But those were really, formative influences. I don't know if that's really answering what you're saying.
I was more specifically pointing at the question of inertia in the work, like cultural inertia, how, because in a way that, I mean, I would call it like that, the way you offer resistance to some kind of purity in the categorizations, in favor of more material kind of difficulty in the work, that is open-ended, and at the same time it's sort of precise in scope. And it seems that has something to do with a certain tactile aspect of practice. That in a way, that's what I was tracing back.
Well, I was a craftsman before I even went to architecture school. I was a metalsmith. So it has it has an effect on what I do. I've always been making things before, way before I went to, formally in terms of design.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to close it for today. I want to invite people for the last segment of work in the lab, and particularly those that are not participating, to come and join us on Saturday. We're going to have a nice discussion along the whole day, and then again, thank you, Jesse, for coming.
Pleasure.
Yeah.